You know, there's a phrase the Swedish Academy used when they handed out the Nobel Prize in literature back in 2001. They talked about incorruptible scrutiny.
It's a powerful phrase. It sounds almost heroic, doesn't it? Like a kind of superpower.
It really does. It sounds like X-ray vision for the soul or for society.
Mm-hmm.
But today we're looking at a man who, well, who arguably turned that superpower into a weapon.
We're talking about Sir V.S. Naipaul.
Exactly. And the deeper you go into the sources, and we have a lot of them, the biographies, the critical essays, his own wife's personal diaries, the more you realize that this scrutiny, it wasn't just about writing beautiful sentences.
No, it was about dismantling things, dismantling people, places, entire cultures.
Including his own. And that, right there, is the heart of the tension we're going to explore in this deep dive.
It's a massive paradox, isn't it?
A huge one. On one hand, you have this absolute titan of English literature. I mean, the accolades are staggering. Knighted by the Queen in 1990, Booker Prize in 71, the Nobel in 01. A man who wrote prose so clean, so precise, it's just intimidating.
But on the other hand,
you have a man who was described famously as a witness for the Western prosecution, a figure just hammered with accusations of racism, misogyny, incredible cruelty in his personal life, and what seems to be a shocking lack of empathy.
And our mission today is to try and figure out how those two things can possibly coexist in one human being. We've got a huge stack of materials here. There's Patrick French's authorized biography, The World is What It Is, which is just incredibly revealing.
Almost uncomfortably so.
Deeply uncomfortable. Then you have the critical takedowns from intellectuals like Edward Said and Robert Harris. And of course, the intimate, absolutely heartbreaking diaries of his first wife, Patricia Hale.
And the books themselves. We're trying to map what Naipaul himself called the topography of the void.
That's the key concept, the void. Naipaul was obsessed with societies that he felt had been hollowed out by history, by colonialism. But to understand why he saw voids where other people saw, home, you have to understand where he came from.
So let's start at the very beginning. Let's go to that void before he tried to fill it with words. We need to go to a small sugar plantation town in Trinidad in the early 1930s.
Chaguanas. This is where Vidyadhar Suraj Prasad Naipaul is born, August 17, 1932. And if you look at the history of that place at that time, Naipaul is part of a very specific and very traumatic slice of the British Empire's history.
He's a descendant of indentured laborers?
Yes.
Can we just pause on that term? Indentured laborers, I think a lot of people hear that and they either gloss over it or they just think immigrant workers. But the context is much, much darker and more specific to the machinery of empire.
So much darker. This was the system the British Empire pivoted to after they abolished slavery in the 1830s. The sugar plantations, especially in the Caribbean, they still needed bodies. They needed cheap labor to cut the cane, but they couldn't legally use slaves anymore.
So they looked east.
They looked to India, specifically to regions that were being devastated by things like the Great Famine of 1876, and they would sign people up for these 5-year contracts.
It was basically a desperate trade. You escape starvation in India to do this back-breaking labor halfway across the world.
That's precisely it. Naipaul's grandfathers, from both sides of his family, came over on those ships in the 1880s and 90s. So he's born into this displaced community. They're culturally Indian, specifically Hindu Brahmins, but they're geographically stranded in the West Indies.
And you mentioned they were Brahmins. Now that's the high caste, the priestly caste, right?
Theoretically, yes. In the Hindu caste system, Brahmins are the priests, the scholars. They're at the top of the spiritual hierarchy. But here's the irony, and it's an irony that I think haunted Naipaul his entire life. In a muddy plantation town in Trinidad, that status means nothing. It's invisible to the outside world.
To the colonial overseers, they're just laborers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were just another group of workers. They're living in what Naipaul later described as a destitute society.
The sources describe this really vivid sensory transition happening during his childhood. It feels like you're watching a culture just dissolve in real time. The Indianness is fading.
It's the created self, emerging from the ruins of the old world. You can see it in the physical environment. They go from living in traditional mud huts with earthen walls to, timber houses on stilts. You see it in the diet.
Right. They were historically vegetarian Hindus.
And suddenly they're eating chicken and fish because that's what was available and it's what the surrounding Creole culture ate. The old rules were breaking down.
On the clothes, too. That's a huge signal.
A massive signal. The men start wearing Western trousers. The women start wearing heels and belts with their saris, which creates this sort of hybrid fashion.
Yeah.
But the biggest shift, the one that really defines Naipaul's entire career, is language.
Hindi is disappearing.
It's evaporating. English is taking over completely.
And right in the middle of this cultural slipstream is Naipaul's father, Si Naipaul. He feels like the most important character in the first act of this story. He's the one who sets the whole trajectory.
He absolutely is. Sad is the seed of everything. He was a journalist for the Trinidad Guardian, which was, a very rare achievement for an Indian in that era. But he didn't just want to report the news. He revered the writing life as this almost holy vocation. He worshipped literature.
There's a detail in the biography I love, but it's also kind of sad. It says they lived in an ordered fantasy world.
It's deeply sad. To survive the reality of this plantation town, they built a fortress out of books. Si would read to his son, V.S., or Vito, as he was called, from Nicholas Nickleby and Julius Caesar. They were looking at their muddy, tropical world through the lens of high European literature.
So you have this young boy, he's the eldest son, he technically has all these traditional Hindu duties. He's supposed to be performing the rituals, being the good Brahmin boy.
But his dad is training him to be a Victorian gentleman writer. It's an incredible contradiction.
It must have created a total split personality.
Si basically transferred all of his own thwarted literary ambition onto his son. He looked at Vito and said, "You will do what I couldn't." He essentially drafted his son into a war for literary recognition.
And the main weapon in that war was education.
Yeah.
Specifically, a school called Queen's Royal College.
QRC. And it was modeled strictly on a British public school. The curriculum was all about metropolitan values, standard English, Latin, French. It was an education designed to make you British, even if you were thousands of miles away from Britain.
And the goal of every bright boy at QRC was singular, right? The island scholarship.
That was the golden ticket.
Literally a ticket out.
It was the escape hatch.
Yeah.
If you won, the government paid for you to study anywhere in the British Commonwealth. It was the only way out of the sugar economy. And Naipaul, of course, he wins it.
And he doesn't choose something sensible, like medicine or law, which you'd think a family trying to lift themselves out of poverty would push for.
No. He chooses Oxford, specifically University College, and he's very explicit about why. He wrote later that he chose Oxford in order at last to write. He wasn't going for a degree, he was going for an identity.
There's that anecdote from right before he leaves in 1950 that I found it's touching, but it's also kind of terrifying in terms of the pressure he was putting on himself.
The pencil?
The copying pencil.
It's such a perfect writerly detail.
Yeah.
He goes to a shop in Port of Spain and buys a pad of paper and a copying pencil. And he notes that he bought them because, in his mind, I was traveling to become a writer and I had to start. He's 18 years old, and he believes that buying the stationery makes the identity real.
He's willing the writer into existence.
Completely. It's an act of faith.
So he gets on the boat. He travels across the Atlantic. He gets to Oxford, the intellectual center of the universe. You think, okay, cue the montage of success. He's finally made it.
And it was the complete opposite. The sources paint a picture of just profound disillusionment. It was closer to a horror movie for him.
Really? A horror movie? How so?
Well, he lands in 1950. And socially, he's a ghost. He is totally isolated. He's poor. He's on a scholarship. He doesn't have the right clothes or the right accent. He feels like a complete stranger in England. But he also knows he doesn't fit in back in Trinidad anymore.
He's in limbo.
Exactly. He's caught between two worlds and at home in neither.
And the writing, the whole reason he went there.
It was a disaster. It just wasn't working. He felt everything he wrote was contrived. He couldn't find his voice because he was trying to write like a proper English gentleman, which he wasn't. And about a year in, he just spirals into what he later called a mental illness.
I read he blew all his money on a trip to Spain. That seems impulsive.
Every last penny. In 1952, he was totally impulsive, completely irrational. He called it a nervous breakdown. He spent his entire savings just to get away from Oxford, to get away from the failure. It was basically a cry for help.
But in the middle of this breakdown, he finds an anchor, Patricia Hale.
Pat Hale. She was a history student, and they met at a college play. And she becomes everything to him. She's his emotional support. She's his career planner. She's his first reader, his editor.
But it wasn't some kind of fairy tale romance.
Oh, not at all. Her family was openly hostile because he was Indian. His family was, let's say, unenthusiastic because she was white. But she stood by him. She was the one who saw the genius when nobody else did, when even he didn't.
And then, just as they're graduating in 1953, the hammer drops. His father dies.
This is a pivotal trauma. Si Prasad, the man who built that whole fantasy world of literature, the man who pushed him to Oxford, dies of a heart attack back in Trinidad. And V.S. Naipaul, as the eldest son, is religiously obligated to light the funeral pyre.
But he can't go.
He can't afford it.
Because he's broke.
He didn't have the boat fare. So he's sitting alone in Oxford, imagining his father's cremation, while his younger brother Shiva, who was only 8 years old at the time, has to perform the sacred rites.
That is just a staggering burden of guilt to carry. You're the eldest son, you've left the family, and you fail in the final, most important duty.
Naipaul later wrote that this event marked Shiva with a private wound. But you have to imagine the wound it left on V.S. as well. He had left to become this famous writer to make his father proud, and his father died before he'd published a single word. He had nothing to show for the sacrifice.
And to add insult to injury, his academic career falls apart right after that.
Total collapse. He fails his postgraduate degree, the B.Lid. He blamed the professor, a man named F.P. Wilson. He even accused him of racial prejudice.
Yeah.
But the result was final. His scholarship money was gone. The academic door slammed shut. He later said he hated Oxford and the solitude it brought. The dream had completely soured.
So it's 1954. He's stuck in London. He has no money, no degrees. His father is dead, and he hasn't published a book. This is absolute rock bottom.
It is. But then salvation comes from a very unlikely place. It comes from the BBC.
The Caribbean Voices program.
Exactly. He gets a part-time gig with a producer named Henry Swansea in late 1954. And this introduces him to the freelancers room in the old Langham Hotel.
The way the sources describe this room, it sounds like the Harlem Renaissance, but for the Caribbean. It sounds like this incredible hub.
It was literary alchemy. You have all these writers, Sam Sullivan, George Lamming, just hanging out, smoking, trading stories. And for the first time, Naipaul isn't the isolated other he was at Oxford. He's among his peers. He's hearing the rhythm of Trinidadian speech again, the banter, the calypso voice.
He's reconnecting with the very thing he tried so hard to escape.
Yes. And that atmosphere is what unlocks Miguel Street.
Which is the first book he actually wrote, right? Even if it wasn't the first one published.
Correct. He wrote Miguel Street in just 5 weeks. It's a collection of linked short stories about a street in Port of Spain. It's funny, it's lively, it perfectly captures that specific street energy he was reabsorbing in the BBC room.
But, and this is classic publishing, the publisher didn't want it.
Not at first. It's the eternal struggle. Andre Deutsch, his publisher, basically said, "This is great, kid, but short stories don't sell. Go write a novel first."
So he just churns one out.
He writes The Mystic Monsieur, and he writes it almost cynically. He just wanted to get it done to satisfy the publisher. He wrote it without much enthusiasm, he said. He got £125 for it. But it launched him. He got his name in print.
Now, during this time, he finally marries Pat, but they do it in secret.
They married in 1955 and didn't tell their families for a while. It just shows how precarious their whole position was. For a long time, Pat was the main breadwinner. She was working as a teacher to support them while he worked part-time at the BBC and tried to get his footing as a writer.
In 1956, he finally goes back to Trinidad. He hasn't been back since he left with that copying pencil and all those dreams.
He goes back on a banana boat, the TSS Cavina. And this trip is absolutely crucial because it cements his role as the outsider. He's not returning as a son of the soil. He's returning as a critic, an observer. He writes these long letters to Pat describing the other passengers on the boat, and they are just ruthless.
This is where that incorruptible scrutiny starts to get really sharp.
He does. When he lands, he sees a political awakening happening. It's 1956, elections are going on.
Yeah.
But where other people saw liberation and the birth of democracy, Naipaul saw tribalism. He saw racial lines hardening blacks versus Indian Muslims. He realized the fluid, chaotic society he remembered was gone, or at least changing into something else.
But that chaos gave him the material for his next book, The Suffrage of Elvira.
It did. He went campaigning with his uncle, saw the absurdity and the comedy of the whole election process, and turned it into this brilliant satire. But all of this, the comedies, the early success, it was really just a warm-up. He was building the skills he needed to tackle the big one, the book that would finally fulfill his father's dream.
A House for Mr. Biswas.
The masterpiece. Published in 1961.
Now, for any listener who hasn't read it, this is a big book. It's dense, it's detailed, but at its core, it's a very simple, very personal story.
It's an act of resurrection. Naipaul spent 3 years writing it in a small house in Streatham Hill in London. He later said these were the happiest years of his entire life. He took the tragic, broken, incomplete life of his father and reimagined it into the character of Mohun Biswas.
And the plot is so simple, really. A man just wants a house.
But the meaning is absolutely massive. Mr. Biswas is born with bad luck, he's physically weak, and he gets trapped by his powerful in-laws, the Tulsis. They live in this sprawling, chaotic, communal house called Henneman House, and they demand conformity. They want to just swallow them up into the family collective.
And all he wants is a little piece of his own. He wants a house.
A house is independence. It's a claim to his own existence. It's about not being a footnote in someone else's story.
The book just tackles so much. The crushing weight of colonial society, dependency, the search for autonomy. Patrick French, his biographer, compares it to Tolstoy or Dickens in its scope. It creates a complete world from scratch.
It really does. And there's a quote from Naipaul about the writing process that I've never been able to forget. He said that writing the book destroyed memory.
What does that even mean?
He meant that the fiction he created became more real to him than the actual events of his childhood. He essentially overwrote his own hard drive. The art completely consumed the life. He claimed he knew the book by heart by the time he finished it.
And he dedicated it to Pat, eventually.
Posthumously.
Mm-hmm.
In 2011, which, as we'll see when we get to his personal life, is, well, it's a very complicated gesture.
So Biswas makes him a literary star. He's done it. He's only 29 years old, and he's written what many consider one of the great novels of the 20th century. But then, in the 1960s, something shifts. He moves away from fiction and into travel writing, and the tone changes dramatically. The humor starts to curdle into something much, much darker.
The shift really begins with the Middle Passage in 1962. And the irony is that it was commissioned by Dr. Eric Williams, who was the premier of Trinidad. He wanted a book about the Caribbean by its most famous literary son. He probably expected a celebration of independence.
I bet he regretted that commission pretty quickly.
He got a hand grenade instead of a travelogue. Naipaul looked at the West Indies, his home, and delivered one of the most devastating sentences in literary history. He wrote, "History is built around achievement and creation, and nothing was created in the West Indies."
Nothing was created. That is just brutal. It's a complete negation of the people living there.
It's an annihilation. Naipaul's thesis was that slavery and colonialism had engendered such deep self-contempt that the people there were incapable of true creation. He didn't see nationalism, he saw mimicry. He didn't see culture, he saw confusion. He argued that without the rigid structure of the empire, these societies were just drifting in a void.
And this idea of mimicry, this becomes a central obsession for him for the rest of his career.
It leads directly to his 1967 novel, The Mimic Men.
Can we just define mimic men for the listener? Because it sounds like a sci-fi term, but it's really a sociological critique.
Think of it this way. Naipaul looked at the politicians and the new leaders of these recently independent countries, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia, and he argued that they were just play acting. They were mimicking the structures of the Western powers that used to rule them. They wore the suits, they used the parliament buildings, but he believed there was no substance or real power behind it.
So the idea is that they believe real life, real history is something that happens in London or Paris or New York, so their own governance is just a kind of performance.
They are hollow men. That's the idea. And what's remarkable is that Eric Williams, the very politician he was essentially critiquing, read it and said the term was harsh but true. It struck a very deep nerve. It validated a certain anxiety that was floating around in the post-colonial world.
Naipaul then takes this same scrutinizing gaze to India, the ancestral homeland. You'd expect his book, An Area of Darkness, from 1964, to be about finding his roots, a kind of heartwarming return.
Instead, it was about finding his nightmares. He said that when he arrived in India, he was overwhelmed by two things. First was the anonymity. In Trinidad and in England, he was special. He was the Indian in the room. In India, he was just another face in a massive crowd. He lost his distinctiveness, and he absolutely hated it.
And the second thing?
The physical reality of poverty. But it wasn't just the poverty itself that horrified him. It was what he saw as the Indian reaction to it, what he perceived as a kind of resignation. He saw people defecating in the open, he saw crumbling ruins, and he felt this mix of rage and panic. He couldn't understand why people weren't angrier about it.
There's that story about him visiting his ancestral village that is just, it's so bizarre. It captures his detachment perfectly.
He finally goes to the village where his grandfather came from. A relative comes up to him and asks him for aid for money because they're struggling. And Naipaul doesn't just refuse, he flees. He literally runs away from the village. He called the experience hysteria. He couldn't handle the demand of the place.
It's that tension again. He wants the idea of India, the fairy tale village, but the messy physical reality of it just repulses him.
It's the topography of the void all over again. He goes looking for a center, for a history, and in his view, he finds only darkness and decay. Yet, at the same time, he writes about falling in love with the landscape. He's constantly torn between this profound attraction and this profound repulsion.
This worldview that the post-colonial world is essentially chaotic and hollow, it really culminates in his Booker Prize winner, In a Free State from 1971, and later Gorillas in 75.
These books are where that label, Conrad's heir, really starts to stick. He travels through Africa, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda. He witnesses the chaos of decolonization firsthand. He sees coups, he sees violence, displacement.
And in A Free State, he focuses on these young white liberals who've come to Africa, and he is absolutely merciless with them.
Oh, he despises them. He portrays them as these rootless, naive people who come to Africa to find themselves, but they are totally oblivious to the real danger and the real politics around them. They have no skin in the game. He actually contrasts them with the old white colonial settlers.
Who are often brutal racists.
They might be brutal, they might be racist, but in Naipaul's view, at least they understand the land. They're committed to it in a way the liberals aren't. Naipaul had zero patience for liberal sentimentality. He thought it was actively dangerous.
And Gorillas, what was that based on?
That was inspired by the Michael X killings in Trinidad. Michael X was this sort of charismatic black power leader whose commune turned into a bizarre murder cult. For Naipaul, it was the ultimate proof of his mimic men theory. All this revolutionary rhetoric was just masking empty, brutal, pointless violence.
Joan Didion wrote a famous review of that book where she talks about the pink haze of bauxite dust.
It's such a great observation. She notes that in Naipaul's world, the idea never wins. The physical fact, the dust, the heat, the humidity, the rotting vegetation always dominates and suffocates the idea. The world is what it is.
Which brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this deep dive. Section 7 of our outline is titled, The World is What It Is. That's the title of his authorized biography. And we have to turn that scrutiny on to Naipaul himself.
We do, because you cannot understand the work, especially the later work, without understanding the man's behavior. And a lot of this new information comes directly from Pat Hale's diaries, which were released after her death.
For decades, Pat was sort of the silent saint in the background. She edited his work, she managed his life, she soothed his ego. And how did he treat her?
Horribly. The sources describe him as ill-humored and infantile. He was relentlessly demanding. He would visit prostitutes and then come home and tell her about it in detail. He complained to her face about his sexual dissatisfaction. He essentially treated her more like a staff member than a spouse.
And then there's Margaret.
In 1972, he met a woman named Margaret Murray Gooding in Argentina, and he began a decades-long affair with her. He would leave Pat in their cottage in England and go travel the world with Margaret. It was a very open secret.
And this wasn't just an affair, it was abusive.
It was violent. And Naipaul actually admitted this to his own biographer, Patrick French. He's on the record. He described beating Margaret for 2 days to the point where, in his words, my hand was swollen.
He admitted that. He put that in his authorized biography.
He did. He spoke about it with this terrifying clinical detachment. And Patrick French's assessment is just chilling. He noted that for Naipaul, cruelty was part of the attraction. It fed something in him.
And meanwhile, Pat is at home, and eventually she gets sick.
She's dying of cancer. The timeline here, honestly, is very hard to read. She died in February 1996. Within 2 months of her death, Naipaul ended the affair with Margaret. He just dumped her. And he married Nadira Alvi, a Pakistani journalist who was 20 years his junior.
2 months. He just swapped out the entire support system.
It's brutal. And it raises the question, was Pat just a resource to him? Was she just a tool to get the books written? It suggests a man who viewed people, even the person closest to him, as utilities.
It really complicates the legacy. Here you have a man who demands that we look at the unvarnished truth of societies, but he seems to lack the most basic human empathy in his own life.
And that lack of empathy, that sort of cold, analytical view, bled directly into his later political views, especially his views on Islam.
This is from his books Beyond Belief and Among the Believers.
Right. In those books, he argued that Islam was a form of Arab imperialism. He believed that when a non-Arab country like Pakistan or Indonesia or Iran converts to Islam, it is forced to reject its own pre-Islamic history and adopt Arab history instead. He called it a cultural lobotomy.
Which naturally critics just tore apart. They pointed out it was a massive, sweeping generalization.
Fuad Ajami and others rejected it completely, noting the rich diversity of Islamic cultures and how they blend with local traditions all over the world. But Naipaul wasn't really interested in that nuance. He was interested in his overarching thesis: colonization destroys identity. Whether it's British colonization or what he saw as Arab colonization, He saw the same destructive pattern everywhere.
And yet, despite the accusations of racism, despite the revelations about his misogyny, despite all the controversy, in 2001, he wins the Nobel Prize.
He does. And the Nobel citation is fascinating. They didn't praise him for being a nice guy. They praised him for his united perceptive narrative and incorruptible scrutiny, and for compelling us to see suppressed histories. They compared him to a modern philosopher in the tradition of Voltaire.
But the critics didn't let up. Robert Harris called his portrayal of Africa racist and repulsive, and Edward Said had perhaps the most famous critique of all.
Said called him a witness for the Western prosecution.
What was his argument exactly?
Said's argument was that the West loved Naipaul because he validated their deepest prejudices. He was a brown man from the colonies, telling them, yes, you were right all along. These third world countries are hopeless and chaotic without you. Said felt Naipaul was punching down, using his immense talent to confirm colonial mythologies.
And what was Naipaul's defense against all this? How did he see himself?
He had a great line for it. He said he transforms rage into precision.
That's a hell of a quote. Rage into precision.
It implies that the anger isn't just an emotion. It's a tool for seeing clearly. He genuinely believed he was the only one brave enough or perhaps damaged enough to tell the ugly truth that everyone else was trying to ignore.
So as we wrap this all up, how do we synthesize this man? We have the boy from the sugar plantation who conquered the literary world. We have the so-called truth teller who might have just been blinded by his own trauma. We have this man who was essentially a man without a home.
I think Naipaul's legacy is one of brutal aliveness. He absolutely refused to sentimentalize the world. He refused to pretend that the empire didn't leave deep, permanent scars. But he also refused to pretend that the victims of empire were somehow automatically saints. He looked directly into the void, and he mapped it, inch by painful inch. He forces you, as a reader, to look at the things you'd much rather ignore.
But here's the final provocative thought for you, the listener. Something to chew on after this.
If we accept that Naipaul spent his entire life obsessed with mimic men, these people who play act at life because they feel they're hollow inside, we have to ask the question, did he ultimately become one himself?
What do you mean by that?
I mean, did his ruthless, single-minded pursuit of the idea of truth, that cold detachment, that calculated cruelty, did it eventually turn him into a man who was just mimicking humanity? Did the scrutiny eventually corrupt the scrutineer to the point where he couldn't actually feel for the real physical people closest to him?
That is the ultimate paradox. The man who saw everything, but in the end, maybe felt nothing at all.
Precisely. And the value of reading Naipaul today isn't about agreeing with him. It's about engaging with that tension, what Joan Didion called the unbearable tension between the idea and the physical fact.
A complex man, a very difficult legacy, and a fascinating deep dive. Thank you for listening. We'll see you on the next one.